Real quick, before we get into the show, I wanted to share a new service called Getita that Ken and I have been using that has made us over $10,000 in Amazon reimbursements. The service requires no monthly subscription, and Getita collects a small percentage of the money they recover for you. It takes less than 5 minutes to set up and works on all Amazon marketplaces. Go to Getita.com, Getida, and enter promo code FTM400. That's FTM for Firing the Man 400 to get your first $400 in reimbursements commission free. How much money does Amazon owe you?
There was no way that it was worth trading my time for money, putting my body at risk. I look back at that job throughout my life and I think you need to consider, what is it worth to your body? You have one vessel, right? You have one body. And so anything you do, any job or whatever, you need to consider, is it worth it, the risk?
There are great places to work out there. And if you don't like your job, don't spend the next 5 years continuing to hate your job. Go find a good place to work, because there's a lot of them. And huge piece of that is learning. And so I would say the amount of compensation that I earned, like in terms of dollars into my account, relative to the amount of information I was able to like process and observe, that form of compensation, I believe, is greater.
Welcome everyone to the Firing the Man podcast, a show for anyone who wants to be their own boss. If you sit in a cubicle every day and know you are capable of more, then join us. This show will help you build a business and grow your passive income streams in just a few short hours per day. And now your hosts, serial entrepreneurs David Schomer and Ken Wilson.
Welcome, everyone, to the Firing the Man podcast. On today's episode, we continue our conversation from last week, where Ken and I recap our jobs that we've had that have helped shaped us into the businessmen we are today. All right, Ken, so one of your next jobs that you pulled a lot of lessons out of.
Yeah, absolutely. This next one here, it's a funny story looking back on it. It is my shortest job that I can remember. And so I was kind of in the gap between the last job I covered and this one. You know, I kind of bounced around between other jobs. I think we talked about it before on the podcast. I think if I remember back, I've probably had 30 or 40 jobs. So this one, I was about 20 years old, and I was kind of getting out of the fast food jobs, and I'm like, I need something more money, something different. And so I had a friend that worked at, and I'm not going to say the company on this one here. I don't want to. I had a friend that worked at this company, and he's like, yeah, man. He's like, man, I'm making, $14 an hour or $12 an hour, whatever it was. It was several bucks. It was a lot more than what I was making at the time. And so he's like, yeah, he's like, great benefit. They have benefits. They have all this. So I'm like, okay, cool. And it was a short drive, maybe 5 minutes from where I lived. So I'm like, okay, let me go check it out. So I went down there. They had a job fair. I applied. They accepted it. I started like 2 weeks later. I had to get like my eyes checked. They gave me like work boots, the whole nine. I'm like, this is legitimate. So I showed up first day on the job. Showed up. I did like a 2-hour orientation where I filled out tax papers and everything else. And then they sent me in. That was probably about an hour. Then they sent me in. And then they showed me around the factory, and they made refrigeration devices like freezers, refrigerators, more on the commercial side. If you walk into a gas station, all of those refrigerators with the drinks in them, that's what they made. And so the job they were going to train me on was the wire racks. They made the wire racks that go into those. And so they're like, hey, this is so-and-so. He's going to be your trainer, and this is the machine you're going to be training on. And it was like this press, like that you loaded it up with all these like little wires. You had a box of wires here, and you loaded them up. Not really wires, more like wire bars. You loaded them up, and then the press came down and like welded it all together, right? And so, but it was really fast, like boom, boom. You had to like load them up, boom. And so, I went to shake the trainer's hand, and he was missing 3 fingers. And I immediately was like, oh shit, like what's going on here? And so then I was like I was on edge, and he's like, yeah, he's like, this thing is very easy. He's like, you just have to load these and load this. And then, you're supposed to hold this safety button to get it to go down, but that takes too long. So you don't really have to do that. You can bypass it by doing this. And I was very like, uh-oh. And so he's like, I'm going to be at this other machine over here. If you need anything, let me know. So he goes away, and I start doing this, and I realize like this is an extremely dangerous thing here. And so I'm running this machine. And so I figured out I'm just going slower, very methodical. I don't want to cut my fingers off. And so after like an hour and a half, at that time, I used to smoke cigarettes at that time. And so I was like looking over at that guy. I could see him, and I like I motioned like cigarette, and he yelled. Oh, it was very loud in the plant, and he yelled, "We get a break in an hour and a half." And so I'd been there for an hour and a half, and then he's like, "You get another break in another hour and a half." And so I'm like, oh shit. So I kept working. So 3 hours in, I see him take his stuff off, and he comes over. He's like, "Hey, it's break time. Where's lunch?" And so, and then I ask him like, "Well, when is like, do we get any other breaks?" He's like, "Yeah, you get one in the afternoon. After 3 hours, you get a 15-minute break." And I'm like, okay. So I got all my stuff, and then I went out to my car, and I took lunch. They didn't have any place to like do lunch there. And so I went out to my car, and I was like, this is not for me. And I left. I literally just left. That was like half a day, 4 hours. And yeah, I was like, so the stuff that I learned there was like doing that job. It was literally the exact same thing. My shoulders were super sore. My fingers were sore from loading all of these wires. I probably made, 80 of those racks or 100. It was a lot. So I was completely sore. I'm like, yeah, this is not something I want to continue to do, as well as this is not worth getting my fingers cut off for. This is really dangerous. And so that was my shortest job ever.
That's funny. But, had you not quit, instead of giving a high five, you may just only be able to do a high two.
I agree. Yes. And that was, there was no way that it was worth trading my time for money, putting my body at risk. And so that's kind of, I look back at that job throughout my life, and I think, you need to consider, what is it worth to your body? You have one vessel, right? You have one body. And so anything you do, any job or whatever, you need to consider, is it worth it, the risk?
Absolutely. So it's funny that one was kind of a negative work experience. Mine is also a negative work experience, and still there's like some good lessons to be learned on this next one. So while working at my corn stand, this guy stopped by and said, "Hey, you seem like a hard worker. Would you be interested in being a busboy?" And that is, for people who aren't familiar with the term, it's the person that goes and picks up the dishes off of someone's table when they're done eating. And I was like, sure, yeah, I'll give it a try. You remember the show To Catch a Predator?
Yeah.
So the guy that hired me was eventually on that show.
As a predator, or
as a predator.
Oh, wow.
And fortunately, he never got me, but he's a bad dude. And he ended up going to jail for a while for that. So got hired at this place, and they did wedding receptions. And it was run by this guy who was an absolute scumbag. And he was always angry. And the reason he was angry was his wife moved to the U.S. on a green card. But after on the 5th year of being married, she said, "Peace out. I've got my U.S. status. I don't need you anymore." And that happened around the time that I started working. So he was just angry all the time. And so, a couple of things that I learned from this job is to always tip people well in the service industry. And I would say that has been something that I've carried with me throughout my life, is that service industry is hard. And I would, usually you don't tip the busboy. But man, when I got a $10 or $20 tip, that made my night. And so that was, a good lesson that's stayed with me. I would also say is, I got to see firsthand what happens when you don't treat your employees right. He was always yelling and angry about things that were really out of the employee's control. And boy, did he have a lot of turnover. And that was probably one of the biggest problems in his business, was that he would lash out and 2 or 3 people would quit at a time. And then he'd have his predator go out and find more young boys to work there. I mean, it was just kind of a all around mess. And then the last thing was that people make emotional decisions, and they would almost exclusively do weddings. And you see this around weddings or pets or children. I know I make emotional decisions all the time, especially with my kids. I want the best for my kids. And while it may not work out in a spreadsheet, in my mind, I make emotional decisions, which is, we're human, right? And one of the things he would do is, he'd always ask the wedding party, "Do you want to upgrade your wine?" And it was $1,500 if you wanted the next best Sauvignon Blanc. All the wine served at this place was Franzia, poured into a nice bottle.
No.
And so that was one of my jobs, was to take Franzia out of the box, 5 liters, and pour it into these nice bottles. And I remember one time thinking, so when you're done doing bussing tables, you were supposed to come back and do dishes. And I knew that he liked to reuse these wine bottles with a nice label on them. So I washed them and the labels came off. And he was pissed because he's like, do you know how much money those cost? Like $30 a bottle. And I remember thinking like, yeah, that's what your customers are paying for. And so that job did not last long. I think it was just probably a couple months, but while it was not like the best experience, I learned a lot of things like what not to do. And so anyway, that was my couple months as a busboy. And believe it or not, that business is no longer functioning. I mean, they closed down. Long term, you can't do that. You can't treat people like that, and you can't rip off your customers. And, it wasn't until, at that time I was 15, so I didn't really know what Franzia was. Now that I am of age, I realized like that's bottom shelf. That is as bottom shelf as it gets. And what a slimy dude.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was my job.
Yeah. That's super shady. And I guess that one of the other lessons learned too is how not to operate, and how, that's real sketchy. Well, cool. My next one, and as I'm going through all of these jobs, some of them I did like, some of them I didn't like, but they all had good lessons to be pulled out of there, and that's kind of the whole point here. And my next job here is probably one of my favorite. It was a very short job, but I learned a ton. And so at age 25, I went into the U.S. Army, and so I went in there. This was I did a 4-year contract with the Army, and my job was tactical communications, meaning I kind of drove around in a Humvee, and there was a box on the back that plug it in, you have a generator, and you power it up, and you can provide communications for all of the soldiers on the front lines. Satellite, phones, internet, all of that. And so I did that for about 4 years, and I met a lot of great people. I learned a ton, a lot of lessons learned in that short amount of time. One of the lessons is I do not like to be tied to like a contract. So it's kind of like you wake up, and this is a little bit different because it only exists in a few jobs like the military. You can't just say, I quit and leave, right? Like this was a 4-year commitment that you're showing up for every day. And so it wasn't a good fit for me. However, I completed my 4 years, got an honorable discharge, and left. But it was that I noticed like a year in, I was like, yeah, I don't like this. I don't want to be held to something, a commitment for very long. And so that is one thing that I learned out of that. And a couple of others is, the way that at least the Army, the way that it's structured is that they manage teams, mid-level, high-level, low-level, all the way up through. They manage them based on the behavior of one person. If one person does something wrong, the entire unit, the rules change or whatever the case is. And that is so detrimental to morale and to the progress of a unit. And I saw that at scale when I was in the military. And so, David, as we build our team out, these are things that like I notice, like hopefully we are addressing individuals and not the entire team, because it is very detrimental. One case, I had a soldier, he actually worked for me, and he was out, and he got and we had drug testing in our unit. At this time I was living in Germany, overseas in Germany, stationed there. So we had drug testing, and the soldier that worked for me failed his drug test. And so that weekend I had a trip planned with my wife. We were going to go out of the country and go explore. And that came back, oh, so-and-so, failed the drug test, so you're on duty this weekend to monitor. And every supervisor in this unit is on duty to monitor the soldiers that lives in the barracks. And it was, I was like, I was so livid. I was pissed. And that really stuck with me to this day. Like how making rules like that impact a lot of people are just detrimental. And I think, different situation, but also definitely a huge lesson that I learned. And probably, one on the next one, these next two are very, very impactful and very rewarding for me. One of them was, I made a ton of really good friends. I think when you are put in a situation where you're like really struggling and you're overcoming obstacles within a group of people, you bond, and there's like another level of bonding there. It happens in a lot of team sports, in a lot of different environments, but for the military is one for me. And I still have several friends that I talk to, that I talk with now still today, that we had such a bond, this a long time ago that it stuck with them. And these are quality people that I've had lifelong relationships with. And they were formed while we were in this like traumatic situation or this environment where we had to bond to survive. And that is like a different level of like, we kind of reference it as like tribe kind of. And then my last one here is, I got this from this job here and a couple of other ones. When you put yourself in a really rough experience or a challenging time, whether you're restricted from food or sleep or getting shot at, whatever it is, that challenge, whenever you're experiencing it and when you overcome that, the amount of confidence that you have is like sky high. And if I look at my corporate career, like as a supervisor, as a manager, anytime my leadership would be like, hey, I want you to, you're not doing this right. I want you to do this, or this is going to happen, or, hey, how do we solve this problem, or how do we do this? And everybody, I look around and my peers were kind of freaking out. They're like, oh shit, like what's going to happen? And I'm thinking like, if that's the worst thing that you have to worry about, that's a good day. And so when the times get tough, you're able to lean on your confidence of you overcoming obstacles in a previous job. You can pull into present day. And so always try to, whatever obstacles that you overcame, just think of it as like any new challenge that you have. Like, yeah, I can do that. I know I've done it before. I can do this. This is not that hard as that. And so that was probably my most impactful, lesson learned from that job.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. It seems like, as we've been working together, you've referenced a lot of stories about the military, and, we have an employee that is a veteran, and something that I, on the outside looking in, am a little envious of, honestly. It seems like just a really unique experience where a lot of good things come out of it. And so anyway, yeah, that's really cool. Sorry to interrupt the episode. You may have heard Ken and I talking recently about a new tool that we're using for Amazon refunds. Now, I have used other refund tools like this. However, I can tell you in the first 7 days, they scrubbed the back end of my Amazon account going back 18 months and found $5,000 of refunds. And the nice thing about this is it's my money. Amazon made a mistake and they are just auditing my account. The other thing I really like about this tool is there is no monthly fee. They only charge a commission if they are successful in getting you your money. Go to Getida.com, Getida, and enter promo code FTM for Firing the Man, FTM400. This is an awesome tool. Can't say enough good things about it. Now, back to the episode.
David, what's next for you?
So this was my sophomore year of college. I wanted to get an internship, and I interviewed for all kinds of internships, and they kept telling me, like, come back when you're a junior or a senior. And this one firm gave me a shot, and I was going to be doing tax accounting. And, there's one giant lesson that I took away from this, and that is that you can't do everything by yourself. So to kind of set the scene, it was the owner of the company and then 2 interns. That was it. It was kind of a single shingle, like very small firm. And this particular owner was in the mode of doing everything on his own. And I remember one particular story which I will never forget this, is he had a sleeping bag. During tax season, he'd sleep at the office. And, leading up to April 15th, he would just stop sleeping. And I remember like it was yesterday. He had probably not slept in 3 or 4 days and was starting to get delirious, where he'd slur. It was like he was drunk. He'd slur his words, and we had a client meeting. And so he's like, come to this client meeting with me. And so we sit down, his husband and wife on the other end of the table, and we're going to go over their tax return. And he excuses himself and goes into the bathroom, which was right next door. And all of a sudden I hear a boom. And we didn't know what it was. Also, I didn't know much about taxes, so I had like nothing to offer. I had nothing to say to this client. So I was just sitting there wondering, like, what was that boom? What's going on?
Awkward silence.
So then my boss comes back into the room and he's bleeding. He has probably about the size of half of a baseball on his forehead. He had like passed out. and hit his head on the sink. And he had a white dress shirt on, and he had blood going all the way down his shirt. And the look on these people's faces were like, what is going on? And he sat down like, all right, let's get on with the meeting. Blood is running down his face. The wife she's like, I'm going to pass out now. Like, this is disgusting. Like, we need to reschedule this meeting. And it was just an absolute mess. So they ended up leaving. He went back into his office and fell asleep. And, I had heard after a head injury, never let someone go to sleep. And so here's this guy, blood still on his face, sitting in his chair, looks like he's dead. And I look at the other employee who's also a sophomore in college and is like, should we call an ambulance? Like, what should we do? And we went and found an office manager in an adjacent office building and said, we don't know what to do. What should we do? And so she ended up calling an ambulance and taking him in. And so the big takeaway here was this guy tried to do everything by himself. He didn't hire enough help. And you could see where he crashed and burned. And I am sure that client who witnessed all of this probably was not a repeat customer. And it was that was kind of the theme though. I mean, he was like the IT guy. He tried to do everything and he couldn't. And so instead of doing 3 or 4 things really well, he tried to do 20 things and he did poorly at all of them. And it was just a wild experience. But anyway, so that was a lesson from my first internship as a tax accountant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, lesson to be pulled from that is, like you mentioned, David, you can't do everything. You need help. And that was an extreme example of trying to do everything. And what happened? Crashing and burning, right?
Right.
Yeah. No, great story.
Yeah. What's next on your list?
Yeah. So rounding out my list here, it's the last job I have on my list. This was a job that I got right after I left the Army. I was around 30, probably in that range. And it was I was working for the Department of Defense. And at the time, this was post 9/11. For anybody that remembers that, the government knew that our infrastructure for the government was at risk for cyber espionage, cyber attacks, and so they started a program where they moved all of the government communications, all 3-letter organizations and everything under the DoD. They moved it to a private network. And so there was a program they hired me for to come in and help migrate all of that. And so it was a really, really exciting time. I went from making very little money in the Army. And I mean, although I enjoyed what I did there, this was kind of like 2 or 3 levels up from that. So really cool job. I got in, I really hit it hard, learned all I could, got it all, most of it figured out. And then it kind of like, once this project that I was on, once we got this huge network built out, kind of went into maintenance mode, and then kind of everything settled down. And then I really started noticing like things how at scale. This was although it was a civilian job, I worked for the Department of Defense. And so I really got to see how the systems and processes worked on the government side out of the military. And I really saw like a lot of it was working well. People were coming in, they were progressing, and so I got to see how systems and processes worked at scale in the government. And so it was kind of eye-opening. A lot of them were good, a lot of them not so good. And at that time, I knew I didn't want to work for the government anymore. There was I think David and you and I are kind of in the same boat, and probably a lot of people listening, is that our mind goes to kind of scaling where we find something and like we want it to scale. We don't want a ceiling on it, or we want to have room to breathe. This environment that I was in did not have room to breathe. There was a specific steps, and that was all I could go. And so I knew I could only go to a certain level. That was my peak capacity. So at that point, I'm like, yeah, this is not a good fit for me. And along with that, and David, you probably experienced this, and some of the listeners as well. In a corporate environment, there's politics. There's always politicking. There's, it's just kind of like, say, in like high school and college and corporate environment, there's always like politics in the office. And so in this environment, it was extreme because you had government, you had military leadership. So you had like colonels and generals in charge, and then you had contractors working for them. And so and there was also money involved with large military contracts. And so certain people, it was just very nasty and very dirty of politicking. And so I didn't want to have any part of it. And so when I realized that, I'm like, yeah, this is not a good fit. Because I'm not interested in playing politics. I'm interested in, I like to solve problems and things, and this was just not a good fit. So the other thing I learned here as well was how our tax dollars are wasted. And this is just one very, very small example of that. I saw at large scale waste, and it was eye-opening to me. That's why I'm not a huge proponent of funding a ton of money into the government personally. But I'll give you one example. There was a building that I worked at. I'm not going to say where, but there was a building, and then there was an abandoned building next to it, probably the same size as the pig barn, a couple 100 meters by several 100 meters. It was a very large building. And we would go over there sometimes and get supplies for our building that we needed, whether it was a filing cabinet or whatever. Nobody was in this building. It was abandoned apparently for 3 or 4 years. And when I went over there, the first time I went over there, I noticed, David, you and I have talked about this a lot, and the listeners, there's a brand that makes office chairs called Herman Miller. And they are probably the top line, if not in the top 2 or 3 of like most comfortable, highest quality chairs that you can buy for an office. And when I went over there at the time, I didn't know this, that this building had probably 200 or 300 Herman Miller chairs just sitting there, new in the wrappers. And I'm just like, what's going on here? And I asked like, hey, what's going on with those chairs? And then my supervisor at the time said, oh, they were purchased under a specific contract that we can't use them. So we can't bring those over there. No, somebody's going to have to do something with them later. We don't know. And so, I mean, we're talking like those are probably $1,000 a piece or $1,500 a piece, several hundred of them sitting there for 3 years. And so that is like the tip of the iceberg of waste in the government because it's at scale. And so I saw that amount, and it was eye-opening to me of how it was dysfunctional. And so I learned a lot at that job in terms of like technical stuff and systems and processes, how they work at scale. And I also learned how they, at scale, things slip through the cracks. And so it was very eye-opening.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. That's probably $250,000 worth of chairs, which is bananas.
Yeah.
Good chairs too.
Yeah.
Man.
Great chairs.
Yeah.
And it was your tax dollars, my tax dollars, your tax dollars, your tax dollar. It was everybody's.
Man, that's frustrating. Well, very good. Well, my final job that I'd like to talk about is, and, as we've gone through these, we've kind of left out the names of some of these employers. I am going to call this one out by name because it's a first-class organization, and that is Reuben Brown. I worked at Reuben Brown. It's a public accounting firm based in St. Louis, but has offices in Kansas City, Denver, Las Vegas, and just a first-class organization. And I did 2 internships there in college and then started my career there post-college. And, in terms of mentorship and learning and having really cool experiences, I mean, it was awesome. It was a great 8 years. And, while this show is called Firing the Man, do not want that to come off as disingenuous to, some of our employers, because boy, have we learned a lot. And so, while I was there, I got to work on, a $500 million earnings manipulation scheme on a public company. I got to work on 2 Ponzi scheme cases. I got to work on probably like 50 mergers and acquisitions projects. I got to learn how a business is valued. And, the lesson that I took from all of this was there are places where you can go get paid well to learn. And, that 8 years was packed full of so much learning. And so I think that some people, if they don't like their job or they feel like it's a dead end job, yes, you can fire the man and be self-employed, or you can go find a job where you're learning a lot. And, Ken, as you and I manage, several companies right now, the lessons that I learned in those 8 years are being applied literally every day. And like very strategic, like business strategies, but also like some soft skill stuff. And, I'll give an example. One thing that I really liked was they had a mentorship program. You were assigned a career advocate. And, about once a month, I would go and grab coffee with my mentor. And we wouldn't talk about projects. It was just kind of talk about whatever you want. But it seemed like the best conversations always came from that. And, what are you interested in? What fires you up? What projects do you like? Like kind of some of those prompting questions. And then they just listen. And, Ken, as you and I build out our team, we've implemented this. We actually call it coffee chat. And while we have employees all over the world, we set aside an hour, every month or two to just check in with our employees. And there's no agenda. It's just, how are things going? Are there any pain points? Ask some pretty open-ended questions and then just listen. And so it was a wonderful experience. It's a great organization. And so that was, kind of my final lesson is that there are great places to work out there. And if you don't like your job, don't spend the next 5 years continuing to hate your job. Go find a good place to work because there's a lot of them. And huge piece of that is learning. And so I would say the amount of compensation that I earned, like in terms of dollars into my account relative to the amount of information I was able to like process and observe, that form of compensation, I believe, is greater. Like the future value of that information is far greater than any paycheck that I got. And so anyway, so that wraps up our 2-part episode, recapping some of the jobs that Ken and I have had that have helped shape us into the business people we are today. Would be interested in hearing from some of the listeners. What are some positions that you've had, and what are some unique lessons that you've gleaned from them?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of a closing thought, and what you mentioned, David, is I think taking care of the best asset in your business is your people. And there was something missing from a lot of jobs that we had went over, some of them. However, some of the jobs that we discussed on these last 2 episodes, we really liked. Some of them we didn't, but all of them were a good fit at that point in time where we were. And so in hindsight, we can always reflect back and say what we did and what we didn't like out of them, but they taught us something along our journey. And so I think that's very important. You mentioned if a listener's, doesn't like their job now, maybe, ask to work on a different project or a different program. If there's not an opportunity for you, go find another job. I think we're entering a phase of where employees are going to have a little bit more say. The job market is very tight. Unemployment is at historic lows. Amazon just a couple of days ago, there was an Amazon facility that unionized. And so I think we're on the brink of something that's a little bit different that, employees can have a little bit more power. And you always have a voice. I can tell you one thing, as I reflect back on the 30 or 40 jobs I've had in my life, I don't regret leaving any of them. I do not. And so at the time, it's a very challenging decision, but I don't. And so I've progressed at every point. Yeah. Long closing thought, but that's what it is.
No, very, very valuable. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's Firing the Man podcast. If you like this episode, head on over to firingtheman.com and check out our resource library for exclusive Firing the Man discounts on popular e-commerce subscription services. That is firingtheman.com/resource. You can also find a comprehensive library of over 50 books that Ken and I have read in the last few years that have made a meaningful impact on our business. For that, head on over to www.firingtheman.com/library. Lastly, check us out on social media at Firing the Man and on YouTube at Firing the Man for exclusive content. This is David Schomer.
And Ken Wilson.
We're out. Before you go, we wanted to share a new service that Ken and I have been using called Getita that has made us over $10,000 in Amazon reimbursements. The service requires no monthly subscription, and Getita collects a small percentage of the money they recover for you. It takes less than 5 minutes to set up and works on all Amazon marketplaces. Go to Getita.com, Getida.com, and enter promo code FTM400. That's FTM for Firing the Man 400 to get your first $400 in reimbursements commission free. How much money does Amazon owe you?